Hi, I'm Briemmet. 10 years ago, Joseph Holbrook and I came up with what we called a reader's retreat idea. Not a book club, I think we also called it an unconference. That meant there wasn't a division between main speakers and a largely passive audience. Instead, this reader's retreat or unconference would be participatory, level, no experts whose word was law, meeting on neutral ground ideologically and not requiring agreement, and with a real openness to learn from people who don't necessarily share identical convictions and commitments. And to do all of this with small groups of people who simply enjoy reading and discussing books and ideas in a retreat environment. So where to go from here? Well, if there are others out there who are intrigued by this reader's retreat idea, we'd like to do what we can to help that happen. We hope that these short episodes from some of our actual retreats will stimulate your thinking and planning. You can see the links at the bottom of this video for more information.
So the book I'm going to be talking about is a memoir written by Philip Yancey, and he's written about 25 books over the past 25 years or so. All nonfiction books. He was a writer for Campus Life magazine years and years ago, and he's written, some of his books are fearfully and wonderfully made. Surgeon looks at the human and spiritual body. What's so amazing about grace? The Jesus I never knew. Where is God when it hurts? And there's Soul Survivor. So there's a list of some of the books he's written. In this book, he says, is a prequel to all the other books. So it gives you the story of what led up to all his other books. The two themes that his books revolve around are either grace or suffering. And so in the book Where the Light Fell, his memoir gives you an understanding of why he writes about grace and why he writes about suffering. So it begins talking about before he was born, his mother and father married. They were called to Africa as missionaries. In their 20s, his father contracts polio and is in an iron lung for several months. And Philip's 16 months old when his father dies. And he later on, years later, he reads an account of his father's death and realizes that he was in an iron lung, and his mother and some other people decided that he should be removed from the iron lung, and they believed that God was going to heal him. They moved him to a chiropractic hospital and he ended up dying. And so he realizes this had an impact on his life. The book focuses on his relationship with his mother, who's a devout woman, but she has real anger and control issues. And it's also about his relationship with his brother, who is a genius academically and musically, but he gets straight A's without studying. He's able to play music, piano by ear, but he becomes mentally unstable in his older life and becomes addicted to drugs and has a lot of issues that he has to deal with. Philip also talks about growing up in a hyper-fundamentalist faith in a Baptist church in Atlanta during the Civil Rights era, and in both Philip and Marshall are pressured by his mother to go to a Bible college that's also very strict and hyper-fundamentalist. And so he talks a little bit about that. Final chapter, he talks about the outworking of his faith and his relationship with his mother and his brother. And so beginning with his father's death, his mother and father were raising financial support in order to go to Africa and be missionaries. His father gets sick, he dies, so he grows up in a very poor environment because his mother does some odd jobs and things. She never remarries. They have very little money. And his mother makes a vow that both of her sons would take their place as missionaries to Africa. And she makes that vow upon her husband's grave. And she prayed either that God could call them as missionaries or take both of the boys the same as he took their father. So I'll just read a little bit of an excerpt from it. And she's having a discussion with the boys. They're pretty small still, but Philip describes it, says, she moves the spoon around her coffee cup for a while before resuming. I went to the cemetery, she says, to the grave you just visited. A fresh grave then, still mounded with dirt that hadn't settled. I threw myself face down on the dirt, prostrate, my arms stretched out across the mound, and sobbed and cried out to God. Like Hannah. This is a story that God gave me. Right then and there, I dedicated you both to God. I asked him to use you boys to fulfill the dream that your dad and I had, to replace us in Africa as missionaries. And for the first time, I finally had some peace about his death. Marshall and I did not move. Marshall's his older brother. My stomach is fluttering, and I'm afraid even to breathe. We have never seen mother like this. To cry, usually she goes into another room. She sniffles some and then adds one thing more. I made a decision to never remarry. My job was to take care of you two. Both of you had health problems when you were younger. Marshall, in Arizona, you caught a desert fever that doctors said was rheumatic fever. Several times I had to rush you to the hospital, the high temperature, almost convulsing. Philip, you had asthma and pneumonia. You could cough your lungs out. A couple of times I had to drive you two to the emergency room. Each time, before putting you in the car, I would kneel down and pray, Lord, if you don't want them to fulfill their father's place as missionaries in Africa, go ahead and take them now.
Oh my goodness.
They're yours, I've given them to you. So this was part of what shaped his early understanding of his relationship with his mother and relationship with God and relationship with the church and what his calling was. So it had an impact on him as he was growing up. His mother, the church that she was a part of, believed what was called the victorious Christian life, which most churches have a sense of what that is. And one of the comments Philip makes is that we can't put together the two people who are our mother. The angelic one everyone sees and the volatile one we live with. She would have some bursts of anger, whether it had to do with just being a single mother under all this pressure, financial pressure, and health issues with her sons, and the loss of her husband or whatever it was. There were issues there. And then he says maybe, and he talks about how this influences the view of God. He said, maybe God is like my mother, a super person who loves me and schemes to rape me. His mother teaches some classes. She drives a bus for the church. She does some things like that. She teaches Bible classes. They have very little income, so they move around a lot in the Atlanta area. And so in 5 years, he goes to 5 different schools. And eventually they buy a little trailer and put it on this church parking lot, so they're allowed to keep their trailer mobile home there where they live. And so he calls himself Trailer Trash. And so that's part of his picture of himself growing up. He will get off the bus coming home from school at somebody else's house and walk home so you don't see where he lives, just because of the effect that it has. And there was one man named Peter Ruckman, and he says in the 60s, and the civil rights movement is making daily news in Georgia. Freedom riders and the protesters are demanding an end to whites-only schools, restrooms, and lunch counters. Peter Ruckman, the Bible teacher that they have this week, uses his workshop to defend segregation, citing the same curse of Ham theory that I hear at Colonial Hills, which is the church he goes to. Read Genesis 9 for yourself, he says. God cursed Ham and his descendants to be servants. Campers, this is where the Negro race comes from. Then Ruckman grins and moves from behind the pulpit. Have you ever noticed how coloreds make good waiters? Watch them sometime. They swivel their hips around the chairs and they hold those trays high without spilling a drop. He does an exaggerated imitation and the campers laugh. Don't you see that's the kind of job they're good at? But have you ever met a Negro who's the president of a company? Have you? Name one. Every race has its place and they should accept it. We'll get along fine as long as we stay separate and don't mix. So this is a little bit of a picture of what he's, the environment he's growing up in. So that flavors some of what his life is like.